Hello and welcome to this video on a drug that gets touted as an alternative to current drug addiction medication, Ibogaine. Ibogaine is an example of traditionally used herbal or similar remedies that have a measurable effect but are also not reliable. This is a problem common to such remedies since the dose is inconsistent and so the effect is equally inconsistent. What does happen is when you consume the source of Ibogaine, you basically get a psychoactive effect. In this case, it's a psychedelic or hallucinogenic drug. Unlike other drugs, this is supposedly non-addictive, although we would argue simply less addictive. But there's also relatively limited laws around its regulation and control, which is somewhat unique. Historically, at least, Ibogaine finds its origins in several plants of Central African origin. These plants include cultivars of Tabernaceae iboga, Vacanga africana, and Tabernaceae montana undulata. All of these plants, and several others for that matter, contain ibogaine. However, it is not in a purified or refined form. This means that each has variability. Not just a variability in how much is present, but also how potent it is to a certain extent. Largely because no matter how you extract it, there is going to be a certain amount of it that's just not purified or at least refined enough to have the effect you're expecting. But given its historical use, that's not a major problem. And that's down to the fact that, at least identification-wise, its function and effect is traced all the way back to the pygmy tribes of Central Africa. These, in turn, communicated to the Twi tribes, who in turn communicated to the French. And this eventually led to it being taken back to Europe by the turn of the 20th century. Since 1956, it can be wholly or partially synthesized, which is a beneficial element simply because you can reliably control dose if you are synthesizing it, whether it is partial or completely. Like all drugs, there's no perfectly safe compound or dose, and in this case, Ibogaine does have some drawbacks. Ibogaine is an indole alkaloid, and honestly this is not a very helpful description because it's a very large group of similar compounds, but they all have similar effects on the peripheral and central nervous system. This can antagonize serotonin receptors, and for that matter other receptors. By itself, that also explains some of the effects observed, particularly as a psychedelic drug. It also explains some of the observed cardiac dangers. Ibogaine itself, it can have cardiotoxic effects, or in simpler terms, toxic to the heart, nerves, and muscles. It's noteworthy that much of the, let's say, evidence for and against this is derived from clinical studies where, well, the trials themselves haven't been very clear and unable to find particular indications on dose, but a lot of the negative consequences come from case studies. So it's not entirely clear as to which is the, let's say, clearest position. There's also the, effectively, metabolite, or effectively the active drug, let's say. And Ibogaine in this case acts as a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, but it also has an effect on the kappa opioid receptors and the mu opioid receptors. In some ways, it's both an inhibitor and an agonist, and this is kind of important as the ability to work in multiple ways means that you can have multiple effects on different receptors in different ways and cause a series of different effects, which all in turn make it very hard to trace back exactly how it's working. Further to that, we have issues around its metabolism in the body above and beyond that. What happens is the cytochrome family of enzymes within the body, basically one of the major groups of enzymes that breaks down drugs in the human body, will turn your Ibogaine into Iboghaine, and this in turn means that the metabolite can have just as many effects on the body, since it also has an effect on many of these same receptors. So we have the effectively drug, Ibogaine itself, affecting the serotonin receptors, but then once it's metabolized, it now has an effect on a series of other receptors in different ways. The other important element to this is that Iboghaine, the metabolite, is by itself a slightly longer lasting product as it has a longer half-life. but also Ibogaine itself can be deposited in fat tissues and then released over time, leading to you getting effectively 2 different doses from the same drug. The original Iboghaine itself, which as it's released and the body metabolizes it, into Iboghaine, which is also then released, meaning that controlling the correct dose is actually much harder. And even if we were to be able to at least predict the dose, getting it in purified form is the next major challenge. And this is where we mentioned previously the importance of being able to synthesize, either partially or preferably completely. There are 2 pathways that are often used. Both of these are fairly complex and involve a series of reactions trying to convert different drugs successively, largely through either, say, reverse engineering Iboghaine into Iboghaine, or from other methods again that use Iboghaine as a precursor molecule, or at least the precursor to, and then converting it into Iboghaine itself. Now, you might wonder, given all of this difficulty in making it and the questionable drug utilization, why is it popular? Or at least, why is it worth pointing out and discussing? And it's down to the claimed therapeutic benefits. Therapeutic benefits is the more political way of saying it's supposed to be better for people and used as an alternative to various addictive drugs because this is not as addictive, or some claim not addictive at all, which seems unlikely, but nonetheless, we'll take them at their word for now. The use it has is generally in treating addiction to opioids, but it can also be used in treating other addictions, let's say. Alcohol and methamphetamine are particularly good examples. There's also very limited evidence to support its use in compulsive behaviors and certain, let's say, similar issues, to be polite about it. The other thing we've already mentioned, although this does vary significantly across jurisdictions, or countries if you will, is the legal status of Iboghaine. Now, in a lot of countries, it hasn't been criminalized because it's considered effectively a herbal supplement, but because of its psychedelic qualities, it may also be covered by other laws that criminalize it because it alters the state of mind. And so there's often not a specific law covering it, but other countries haven't, let's say, excluded it either. And because of this, the exact status of it is very much a grey area in most countries. A lot of countries have basically taken note of it and are considering how they're going to classify it. And so its exact legal status, as mentioned, varies drastically, and in some cases there is no status for it to speak of. It's a thing that's known of, but actually getting it is nigh on impossible. That this is also an example of traditional drugs, medication, herbals, and so on, that are in the pathway to becoming a registered and standardized medicine. Unlike some examples, this seems to be stuck in limbo. It hasn't made its way very far along the pathway of going from effectively herbal supplement to medication, but it hasn't been recognized, or at least registered, as a medication and therefore become an illicit drug in many places. For example, like opioids, cannabis, and other herbals have been. Opioids, for instance, are simply made from the opium poppy, but because of its rather addictive nature and, well, to be blunt about it, a lethal nature under the right circumstances, it's very much illegal. Cannabis has other history to it, and then there are other herbal products that are most definitely illegal, and yet this isn't. And so, depending on what happens going forwards, it may or may not find its way as an actual medication, but most research into that has stalled, mostly owing to the unfortunate demise of various participants in trials of it, which is a matter for another video. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.